Oral History with Charles Oppenheim. Well, welcome, Charles. So the first question I really want to ask you is, how did you become interested in information science?
It was when I was doing my PhD. I did a PhD in chemistry, and I was investigating the synthesis of new compounds which had never been created before. And I discovered when I was doing that PhD that I was much more interested in doing literature searching than actually doing the chemistry itself. And in fact, I enjoyed the literature searching so much that I offered to do literature searching for my fellow PhD students, who were only too delighted to have me do that for them. And that carried on for a little while until my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, called me in and said, "You're not making any progress at all, and all I ever see is you in the library searching the literature. You need to get on with your PhD." So I did do, but it was at that point really I decided that I wanted to do literature searching for the rest of my life, which perhaps was a bit eccentric, but that was my decision. I then went to the careers advisory people, this was at Manchester University, and said, this is my situation, I'm finishing my PhD in chemistry, but I want to spend my life searching the chemical literature for other people. And the careers advisory people said, no such job, doesn't exist. But I persisted, which is perhaps a bit surprising. And I wrote to various companies on spec saying, I'm about to complete my PhD, I would like to do literature searching for you. And it turned out that in fact, this was in 1970, or late 60s, very late 60s, that in fact information science, as I later discovered the term was well established. It was just that the careers advisory people didn't know about it. And indeed, one of the companies that I approached, which was Glaxo, a pharmaceutical company, now GSK, said, yeah, come up for an interview. And in fact, I got a job as an information scientist at Glaxo starting in 1970. So that's how I started, really.
Brilliant. That's really interesting, actually. So what would you say the most significant steps in your career have been?
Well, my career had been split between being an information scientist at Glaxo, being an academic, teaching students about information science, which I've done at various stages, and particularly at the last stage of my career, and also working for the electronic publishing industry, mainly doing license negotiations with clients or with third-party suppliers of information, data. And I think what has really helped me, I've been changing from one to the other. So I've got experience of being a searcher for information, of being involved in the creation and the marketing and the licensing of electronic information, and of teaching the next generation of students about information science. And I think it's that combination which has been so much fun for me. Yeah.
So what do you think, in your opinion, did you contribute to the field?
I guess 2 or 3 things I've contributed to the field. First, my first area of interest in information science, because that was the job I was given at Glaxo, was patents information. And I discovered very quickly that in fact patents information sources were not terribly reliable and they needed to be improved. Major sources like chemical abstracts, their coverage of patents really wasn't adequate. So I actually did some studies on it, and my very first articles, which I got published, which was in 1974, I think, was on the poor coverage of patents by chemical abstracts and by certain other abstracting and indexing services. And I'm delighted to say that either they were planning to change anyway, or I would like to think they were influenced by me, that in fact these various abstracting and indexing services made a positive effort to improve their coverage of patents, which are a very important source of scientific technical information. And so that, I would say, was my first victory, if you like. Subsequently, later on, I got very interested in copyright and licensing, and I would like to think that I have spread awareness amongst the library and information profession about the importance of copyright and the need to negotiate robustly with copyright owners, and so on. So I'd like to think that is an important contribution. The third area of contribution I think I've made is in the field of bibliometrics, where I, perhaps because of my scientific background, I'm fairly numerate. I discovered that relatively few people were doing studies on citation counting or publication counting as a measure of impact of an individual, an organisation, or indeed a country. And I'd like to think that I did contribute to the literature of that and made some interesting observations about it.
Excellent. I'd say that you were pretty influential, certainly in the area of copyright. That's for sure.
Thank you.
Can you tell us of any colleagues who were most influential in your work? Any particular names spring to mind?
Yes, a couple. One was my very first boss at Glaxo, a guy called Dennis Caldwell. He was an enormous influence because he taught me, I'm not quite sure how he taught me it, but he taught me this intuition that enough is enough. You've reached the end point of the search. If you keep flogging away at it, you might get the odd one or two more items, but it ain't worth the effort and the time. And somehow, well, I know how he did it because he asked me to do a search quite early on in my career, and I was collecting photocopies, a great pile of stuff on my desk, and he happened to come into my office and said, "What's all this?" And I said, "This is what I'm collecting for the literature search." And he said, "You're mad. You've got far too much stuff. We don't need that much stuff for the literature search." And so he gave me the confidence to know when to stop doing a literature search. And the other person, I think, was Eugene Garfield, who was at the time the boss of Institute for Scientific Information and a big name in American Society for Information Science Technology subsequently. And I first met him at a conference in the UK. I think it must have been something like 1978, 79. And we got chatting, and he was the one who got really into bibliometrics. And he presented me with a copy of his book that he had just written on the field of citation analysis. And he autographed it, still one of my treasured possessions. And I read the book, I absorbed from it, and then I started doing research into citation analysis and bibliometrics. So I think those two people were the biggest influences on my professional career.
Okay. And what has been ASIS&T's role in this and in your own work?
I can't remember exactly when I joined ASIS. It was before it became ASIS, and it was just ASIS, American Society for Information Science. I think it probably would have been at the time that I entered academia at Strathclyde University, which would be 1992. I was already reading the Journal of American Society for Information Science, and I found it had a lot of articles which were of interest to me in my research interest areas. And so I decided to become a member of ASIS in order to get the journal. And to be quite frank, that was the only reason. So because I wasn't based in the USA, I didn't attend any meetings. The annual conference was always at the wrong time of year because it was in the middle of the academic year, so I couldn't go to it. The bulletin which it produced wasn't particularly interesting to me, and indeed the special interest groups didn't produce that much of interest to me. It was the journal. And I remained a member until I retired. I retired from academia 3 years ago, and at that point I ceased my subscription to the journal. And so the journal's given me ideas. It's also given me a publication vehicle. I've got published in it a few times, and basically it's also helped me identify key individuals who are doing interesting research.
Excellent. So moving on then to the world of information science at large, what do you see as the main challenges and opportunities for information science today?
I suppose I would split that question into information scientists as a profession and information science as a theoretical discipline. And for information scientists, one of the big challenges is simply being recognised as a profession in their own right. a lot of people do information science but don't call themselves information scientists at all. They might call themselves information manager or researcher or knowledge manager or whatever. But they're doing what information scientists are meant to do, which is collecting the literature, searching, retrieving literature and analysing it, which I think is the crucial part of the job. Saying that's important, that's not important, this is the actions you should or should not do as a result of my reading of the literature and my passing my report to you. So I think the challenge for information scientists is simply to be recognised for what they are as a profession, an important profession, which helps private sector, public sector, you name it, organisations work more effectively. Information science as a theoretical subject is very, very hard to get to grips with. It's a combination of management science and psychology and all sorts of other subjects which are researched by information scientists. And indeed, if you look at some departments of information science, and I'm thinking here particularly in the USA rather than in the UK, you will find out the academic staff there have got a huge range of disciplinary backgrounds, less so in the UK. And I think information science as a discipline it borrows an awful lot from all sorts of different subjects, but doesn't actually give that much out and is not therefore that well recognised. It's not a criticism of it, it's just a fact of life, but it is a challenge for information science to keep absorbing ideas and then to actually disseminate results of research which are important and relevant.
Absolutely. And what do you consider as the most significant achievement of information science in that case?
That is actually a very difficult question. The most significant achievement of information science might well be in the bibliometrics area. Bibliometrics has certainly become very popular these days, and it is used to evaluate individuals and organisations and so on. And it's increasingly used by funding agencies in various countries to help decide what funding will be passed to what research organisations and universities that are within their remit. And they're increasingly reliant on these bibliometric measures. And arguably that is what information science has brought to the party, is the concept of bibliometrics as a surrogate for impact, for importance, for quality, and for that to be adopted by various organisations and governments as a measure of how well their organisations are doing.
I think I'd agree with you there, actually. So one final question. What would you say in order for young people to get excited about a possible career in information science? So, how would you, what do you think that information science could offer to people? How could you encourage the younger people to come through?
I would say the interdisciplinary nature of it is part of the excitement, that it isn't just one thing and that you can follow your nose. In fact, my career, pursuing as it does copyright licensing and bibliometrics, for example, is a really curious combination, and yet nobody said, that's wrong. So the beauty of it is that you can pursue several avenues at once, and it is intellectually challenging. It can be mathematically challenging. If you want to go into the mathematical side, you do have to be confident about your use of statistics and so on. But in other areas, you are influencing the policies and attitudes of people who do research, of policy makers, of decision makers all over the place. And I think, just to give you an example, and this is perhaps the most rewarding thing that happened to me as an information scientist, was in fact in my first job in Glaxo. And I'd been there maybe 18 months or something like that, and suddenly, out of the blue, Glaxo was the subject of a hostile takeover bid by Beecham's, which was another pharmaceutical company. And it was hostile. The managing director of Glaxo was totally opposed to it, as was the board. And the managing director of Glaxo announced that in 48 hours he would call a press conference at which he would explain why the Beecham's bid was inappropriate. And then a message came down to the information science people in Glaxo: find all the dirt you can about Beecham's, because The managing director said in 48 hours he's going to make a statement. You've got to give him the ammunition. And so we were given various tasks. It was split up between us. But I had to do the patents bit because that was my main searching area. So I did a search on all of Beecham's patents as they existed. And I discovered that even though it was highly profitable at the time because it had a number of key patents which it owned, these key patents were all coming to the end of their lifetime. And almost certainly the reason for the hostile bid was that Beecham's knew it and needed to acquire another company in order to keep growing and so on. And so I wrote this report. I've never worked so hard. I've worked through till midnight in the office, I think, just collecting the data and writing my report. We went straight up to the managing director, and at the press conference, the managing director said, this is a completely inappropriate bid, and the reason why Beecham's are doing it is because their patents are coming to an end and they're going to lose their profitability in the next 2 or 3 years. And indeed, the hostile bid failed. It actually failed, and my prediction was correct. Beecham's profitability sank rapidly, and indeed, ironically, they got acquired themselves, and Glaxo grew from strength to strength, and GlaxoSmithKline now incorporates what was Beecham's.
Wow.
So I can say I helped defeat that hostile takeover bid. I can honestly say that, and it had influence in that way. Just a tiny caveat to that story, which I'll also tell you, which was an embarrassment for me. A couple of years later, quite soon after, the hostile takeover bid had failed, but Beecham's still existed, and I think it reached the peak of its profitability. And I gave a talk to school leavers about careers in information science. It was a big event with hundreds of school kids and who all wanted to do science and technology in some shape or other. And so I told this story and said the rest, as I say, is history. The Beecham's takeover bid failed, and I still confidently predict that it's going to go under sooner or later. I hadn't realised that the next speaker was from Beecham's, careers in Beecham's, and I hadn't realised that. And of course he was furious. And there was an official complaint made to me about my talk. But anyway,
Be careful what you say in public.
Yeah, be careful what you say in public, or maybe take notice of who's following you as a speaker.
Oh, that's brilliant. It's really interesting to hear your story, Charles. I think we'll wrap that up for today, but thank you very much for participating.
My pleasure.